I literally just came back.
But I also like BMX. That's not working.
Jokes on you, they're probably.
Hey, why don't you wear more colors?
Awesome.
We went to the gym. Sorry, I care about clothes. Sorry about the heat. What's this kid saying? That's true. That's funny. I think we can wear more colors. The walking light, you too. White, brown, blue. I can do those. I'm not walking out with it on video. What are you doing today? I think I'm moving under.
Can you start this one brown?
I don't know how to
Are you colorblind? I think but
I'm not complaining. I'd rather be hot than free. Say 70, 80 degrees.
You're not straight at all. No, nice. Are you gonna lie to me? He's not gay. To say
even if he is, you don't have to say it.
you're gonna tell me Arnold Schwarzenegger.
No, because I would
You just said man. I'm not saying he is, but if you got,
I would say Arnold Schwarzenegger.
I've never looked at it.
I want to say Damion Rip. And that's a difference. That makes that clear on the colors.
I'm not even wearing it.
Because you already put that one out.
No, I wasn't. I just realized I worked down my shirt.
I know, I feel like
I come up with random things really quick.
no, you're more
I don't know how they come up. Like when you listen to their podcast.
They're actually genius. Like, how do you
Nelly does that.
think the same thing?
All right, we're going to get started. Really quickly, I just wanted to introduce our speaker for this evening. So thank you all for being a part of the Sport Management Speaker Series. The Sport Management Program puts on different speakers, panels, etc. every year. So this is part of this year's programming. And we're pleased to welcome Dr. Damion Thomas from the Smithsonian African American History and Culture Museum. For those of you in the room, I see several that were part of the visit to the museum on Tuesday. Thanks for that, and hopefully you enjoyed it. This will connect with that experience rather well. That's also an experience that we're hoping to offer for future Towson students. So if you couldn't go this year but you're interested, hopefully that'll be something that will be possible in future semesters as well. For your brief introduction for Dr. Thomas, he earned his Ph.D. from the University of California, Los Angeles, and he is the author of Globetrotters, African American Athletes in the Cold War. So he now serves as the Curator of Sports at the Smithsonian African American History and Culture Museum. Without further ado, thank you, Dr. Thomas.
I'd like to thank you for inviting me. I've known Dr. Boostad since he was yay tall, an incredible student, now a budding scholar here, and I'm really glad to see him in this position, and it's a pleasure to be here today. Man, you guys are here. The Orioles are in extra innings, score tied 2-2. It's 70 degrees outside, and you guys are in here. I'm trying to make it worth your while, but that's a lot to compete with. As Jake said, I'm the curator of sports. I'm going to talk about the museum, and I'm going to talk about my role within it. We're really glad that you got a chance to come, those of you who are able to make it. This museum has been a long time coming. It's been a 100-year effort to get this museum built. The first attempt to get this museum built was in 1915, and that's 50 years after the Civil War ended. Some African Americans who fought in the Civil War tried to get the country to build this museum on the National Mall to commemorate their history and African Americans' contributions to the country. And there have been 4 or 5 other efforts to get this done. Congressman John Lewis from Atlanta introduced the legislation for this museum in 1988 for the very first time, and he introduced it every single year until it was finally signed into law by President Bush in 2003. And here we are now in this facility. This is a $550 million facility. When you look at the outside, you're actually only looking at half of the museum because, as many of you know, in Washington, D.C., you can only build buildings so high, so we had to build down below. It's a 10-story facility. We celebrated our 1-year anniversary. We had 3 million people come in during the first year. And one of the things that we learned is that the average visitor is spending about 5 hours in the museum, which is incredible. The average visitor spends about 90 minutes in the museum, so it's incredible to see people spending that amount of time. This is the first floor Heritage Hall. This is the Cultural Expressions Gallery, and I want to draw your attention to this statue right here. This is a statue done by a Nigerian artist. I don't know if you can see it. There's a 3-part crown right here, which is the design inspiration for the museum. So the museum focuses on African American history. Actually, more accurately, it centers African Americans and the African American experience in American history. But it does that by looking throughout the African diaspora and drawing those sort of connections as well. One of the things you might notice when you see pictures of the museum, the Washington Monument's always in the background. One of the things we've been criticized for is that our museum doesn't look like the other museums on the National Mall. But when you look at our museum from that perspective, you're missing the architectural conversation that's taking place. Our museum is in a conversation with the Washington Monument. One of the central ways that the architect was trying to do that was have the angles and the lines sort of correspond with the Washington Monument. Some other features. And it's this idea that the Washington Monument is sort of reflective of American values. We the people, all people created equal, endowed with certain inalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And in many respects, the condition of African Americans in the United States is a reference point in terms of thinking about how closely the nation has come to living up to those ideals. And so the building itself is designed to be part of that conversation. The way the museum is organized, the history galleries are below ground, the cultural galleries are above ground. So the museum starts with slavery. It actually starts before the period of enslavement in 1400. And that's just to remind people that Black history does not begin with slavery. And then we sort of see the evolution of slavery up through the contemporary moment. This is the Oprah Winfrey Theater. I told you this is a $550 million building. Thus far, our largest donor is Oprah Winfrey. And when you donate $21 million, you get something named after you. This is the Oprah Winfrey Theater, where we have programs and events and things weekly. So it's usually pretty exciting to be involved in the cultural life of the country. This space right here is the Contemplative Court. A lot of people miss this. You know, it's a fancy name. It's the John Hope Franklin Contemplative Court, but most people just call it the waterfall. But it's kind of hidden. But the reason this is in the museum is because we know a lot of the history can be difficult, can be sort of traumatic for some people. We've had people pass out in the museum, people go through these just sobbing kind of fits. And so we wanted to create a space where people could come, sit, catch their breath, reflect on what they've seen, what they've learned, what they've been exposed to. So this is one of the hidden gems in the museum. It's also probably the most photographed space in the museum as well. Now I want to spend some time talking about my own background because I think it definitely influences what we're doing in the gallery. A lot of times people ask me, well, why did you decide to become a curator? To be honest with you, I did. The people who run the museum decided I should be a curator. My background is I'm a historian, I have a Ph.D. in history, and I was a college professor for about 12 years. I taught at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign and the University of Maryland, College Park. In many ways, my journey goes back to being a freshman in college. For some reason, I was not looking forward to going to college. As it turns out, they were the best years of my life. But I'm like, I don't want to think about school. So I put off going to orientation. So I went to the very last orientation you could go to. Now I'm a first generation student, but what I didn't realize is orientation was the time that you picked your classes. So when I went to register for my classes, none of the classes I wanted to take were available. And I ended up with the schedule of death, which included colonial U.S. history at 8 o'clock in the morning, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. But it changed my life. I remember running across campus the first day of class. You know, the classes were on this side and the dorms were on this side. You know, at the time I was pretty athletic and I was trying to be cool, but I was running late to class. So I put on my jogging clothes, trying to act like I was getting exercise, running across campus when I was really just trying to get to class. And I walked into the class. And little did I know I'd be taking class with one of the most significant historians of the 20th century, this guy, Gary Nash. He helped create a field of history called social history. Prior till about 1960, when people studied history, the only thing they studied were presidents and wars. And so in the 1960s, people began to think about the lives of everyday people. What was it like to be a woman in the 19th century? What was it like to be African American? What was it like to be middle class, to be poor? So people began to think about studying other people, and he's one of the people that founded that field. And this is what he said on the very first day of class. I'm speaking to the microphone now. He said, "Whoever controls the present will use their power to control the past in hopes of controlling the future." One more time. Whoever controls the present will use their power to control the past in hopes of controlling the future. And I just sat back. I'm like, wait a minute. History is not just a bunch of facts and figures and about what happened. History is about power. History is about being able to frame what happened and why it matters. And the way history is often used is to make the present moment seem as if it was inevitable, that this is the only way it could have been, that there was no other options available to us. And so history is often been used historically to try to make us believe that women have always been in the home, that blackness has always been looked down upon throughout history. And so history is used as a power tool. And in fact, the reality is that history is not about the past at all. History is about the future. And the history that we construct and the history that we challenge is about the future, constructing it, challenging it, and fighting for power and control of what the future is going to be. And once I heard that, my whole life changed. And from that moment, I decided I wanted to be a historian. So, graduated 4 years later and immediately started a Ph.D. program. So, 21, started a Ph.D. program. Then I get to be 24 and I'm about to finish. And I'm thinking about what my dissertation is going to be. And at this point, I wasn't even thinking about writing about sports. I was doing this intellectual history, sophisticated history. But then this magazine cover hit the newsstand. Sports Illustrated cover. Now the first thing you'll notice is this is not your typical Sports Illustrated cover. Where's Daddy? And this particular issue was about athletes that had kids out of wedlock. And there are some pretty egregious examples. Most famously in this magazine was Sean Kemp, who had 7 kids out of wedlock. Some of you know. Some of you weren't even born, but know this story. And in this article, 2/3 of the 40 athletes that were mentioned were Black or Latino. And I'm sort of reading this article. And the article is significant because it takes place in a larger cultural moment. This article comes out around the time of the Welfare Reform Act that Bill Clinton pushed. Comes out around the 30th anniversary of something called the Moynihan Report. And the Moynihan Report came out in the mid-1960s. It was written by Daniel Moynihan, who became a senator from New York. And what the report said is that black families are too matriarchal and that black families are pathological. And so this is the 30th anniversary, so people are debating this and thinking about these issues. Now, at the time I was aware of this larger political conversation, but when sports became placed at the center of that conversation, I became invested in it. And as I was reading the article, it was kind of like I was in a movie. You know that scene where the person is learning something and then you see all of these flashback moments. And I just began to realize all the time sports had been my entry point to larger political, social, national kind of conversations. And so at that point, I went to my advisor, Ph.D. advisor, and I told him I wanted to write my dissertation on the role of sports in African American history and culture. And he listened and he said, "You're a bright kid, got a good future ahead of you. Write about something more serious." And I was absolutely devastated because I know how important sports had been for me. It had been essential to my relationship with my dad. It's the only thing we talked about. And you see the game, do your homework, that's about it. In terms of my peer groups, it's where I met my closest white friends, was playing volleyball. Now I'm from Los Angeles. I know on the East Coast, y'all don't even have men's volleyball. Boys volleyball at the high school level, but on the West Coast it's really big. And I actually love playing volleyball with people who know how to play. I don't want to just sit back and hit the ball over there. I'm like, no, we want to run some plays. You run a 1, you run this 3, and let's do that. People who know how to play love playing volleyball. But up until that point, I didn't have any close white friends. And so it put me in a different sort of social space, crucial. And so my advisor is saying, this stuff doesn't matter, academics, do something that's meaningful. And I was crushed, I really was. I thought about dropping out of school, thought about, doing something that I didn't love, but I stuck to my guns and I decided I'm gonna write my dissertation on sports. And so I went to the library, checked out every book I could find on sports and just started reading, and then found a project that I could write about that seemed serious, and I wrote a dissertation and later a book about the State Department sending African American athletes around the world to try to manipulate international perceptions of U.S. race relations during the Cold War. So it's the U.S. versus the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union, half of Soviet Union's propaganda around the world was about American race relations. And so the U.S. creates these programs to counteract it. And so that seems serious enough, like a serious enough engagement with sports. And my advisor allowed me to write it. And so then I go on to become a professor, teaching classes on race and sports. And I realized something very important, that I wasn't alone. That for many of my students, sports had also been their entryway to larger political, social, and cultural conversations. And I say that to say that that's what we try to do at the museum. To use sports as an entryway into this history. Now, believe it or not, you think about an African American history, culture museum, the sports gallery was the very last gallery that got approved to go into the museum. And that's for a number of reasons. Number one, the museum was thinking, well, maybe sports is the one thing that America already knows about Black people. Maybe we can cover something else. Secondly, it's just difficult. There's just certain, you gotta make difficult choices. And the third is, how do we do it? How do we do it in such a way that is just not about Black people running fast and jumping high? And so that's one of the reasons why we put the statue out front. Tommy Smith, John Carlos, and Peter Norman, these three men who used their platform at the 1968 Olympics to draw attention to racial inequality, raised their fists, wore badges, bowed their heads, and one of the most iconic sort of symbols of racial activism that was sort of made even more significant because it took place in an international space. Traditionally, America has a rule. You don't see people follow it as much these days, but there's an American rule that you don't criticize the United States outside of the United States. And so these guys violated that sacrosanct rule in order to draw attention before a worldwide audience to inequality. And they paid a tremendous price. Couldn't keep jobs, didn't get opportunities to go professional in football, or had shortened careers. John Carlos, who was the bronze medalist, sitting in the back. A couple of years after this, his wife committed suicide because of the stress that the family incurred because of this moment. He would get a job, and then once people found out who he was, he would get fired. And so the economic strain contributed to some of that the stress that led her to take her own life. Often forgotten in this moment is Peter Norman. Peter Norman was an Australian runner, and he won the silver medal in the 200, one of the big upsets in history. We're talking 50 years later, and he still holds the fastest time in Australia's history. But he wore this badge right here, and that was enough to destroy his life once he got back to Australia. Should have gone home a hero. He was ostracized and vilified for supporting this protest. One of the goals of the Olympic Project for Human Rights was to keep South Africa out of the Olympics, because South Africa practiced apartheid, didn't allow black people to compete on their team. But South Africa was Australia's biggest ally, and so he was seen as being hostile to Australia's biggest ally. So he made the 1972 team, wasn't allowed to compete. He was ridiculed for the rest of his life, and suffered tremendously. And so we wanted to put this here to kind of think about how sports intersects with these larger sort of issues. He's since passed about 10 years ago, Peter Norman, but both Tommy Smith and John Carlos have been at the museum and stood at this statue, took pictures with people for hours, been incredibly gracious. And this is probably the second most photographed space in the entire museum. What we did is organized by the sports that have had the biggest impact in African American history. So there's a gallery devoted to football, to basketball, to baseball, to boxing, and the Olympics, as well as a space devoted to golf and tennis. And one of the things we tried to do was to move away from the sort of individual narrative, or let's just talk about these individuals, but talk about the collective meaning of a particular sport. For example, in basketball, in the basketball room, we tell three stories essentially. One is about racial uplift. Basketball was created by the YMCA, the Young Men's Christian Association, largely because boys and men stopped going to church. And so they wanted to teach these Christian values. And because basketball was associated these Christian values, temperance, chastity, discipline, and hard work, African Americans played early in the 20th century as a way of challenging racism. Or if you think about women's basketball, women playing under different rules and African American women helping to undermine those rules. So tend to tell these larger kind of cultural issues. Football, think about stacking. Stacking was a practice that even when sports integrated, there are certain positions that African Americans weren't allowed to play. Quarterback, middle linebacker, free safety, the thinking leadership positions. In fact, the last position to integrate in all of major sports was the center position. Dwight Stevens of the Miami Dolphins was the first center in the history of the NFL. For those of you who don't watch football, or you're not that familiar, the center is a guy who hikes the ball to the quarterback, but the center also makes all the blocking calls, okay? You're gonna block him, you're gonna block him, you're gonna go this way. And so it's a leadership position, you have to be really smart. That's the last position. Think about basketball, football, baseball. Center is the very last position in all of those sports to integrate. So we sort of get into some of those kind of issues. But when you're curating a sports gallery, you also have to think about your visitor. What is your visitor want? I told you I wanted to move away from the individual stories, but the visitors like it. They want to come and see Jackie Robinson, Jesse Owens, and others. And so what we did is we created this wall in the back called the Game Changers Wall. We have 17 cases devoted to the people, places, institutions, and moments that have transformed sports. And the largest donor, sports donor to the museum is Michael Jordan. Michael Jordan donated $5 million to the museum, so that space is named after him. LeBron James has donated $2.5 million. Nike's donated $2 million. The NBA's donated $1 million. The NBA players have donated $1 million. Kobe Bryant's donated $1 million. Magic Johnson's donated $1 million, and more. So, got a lot of support. But you're able to kind of tell stories in new and interesting ways. This is a torch from the 1996 Olympics, where Muhammad Ali lights the flame. And it's important to think about the 96 Olympics because it's 30 years after the Civil Rights Movement. 1996 Civil Rights Movement, in the 60s. And these games take place in Atlanta. And the 96 games are all about introducing the world to the New South. Let's look at the racial progress that's taken place in the United States 30 years after the Civil Rights Movement. So there's all of these programs and ideas that are sort of floated around about how Atlanta in the United States is doing that. And certainly when you think about it in that context, the only person you probably have light the Olympic torch is Muhammad Ali, who was probably the most hated, ostracized man in America in the 1960s because of his stand against racism in the Vietnam War. And having him light the torch is about bringing the country back together and symbolizing that progress. So we're able to tell stories like that. And I'm going to close with this, but I hope we have time to have discussion about the museum. We can talk about stuff going on in the sports world today. But I want to close with this because people always ask me, what are your favorite objects in the gallery? And I know the politically correct thing to say is that they're all meaningful. But these are the most significant for me because these are Carl Lewis's Olympic medals. Carl Lewis, the great sprinter, won 10 Olympic medals, and he donated 9 of them to the museum. He won 9 gold and 1 silver. And this was our first big donation. And one of the challenges of being involved in this field is that the sports memorabilia market has become like the art market. People are using it as an investment vehicle. You guys remember when Tom Brady's jersey went missing? That's football jersey from a game. That jersey was valued at $500,000. The totality of the gift that Carl Lewis gave to us is probably worth $1.5 million. And when that happened, I said, okay, maybe we can build a world-class collection of artifacts to be able to tell this history and this story. And so these medals have a particularly important place in my heart because these medals gave me the boldness to go sit in Kareem Abdul-Jabbar's living room and Magic Johnson's office and ask for things that were not only sentimentally valuable, but also worth a lot of money. And it's just been amazing how people responded to this museum, which is not about sports history, but really about situating sports within the larger trajectory of African American history and American history. Thank you. Can I get an update on the game? Anybody?
2-2 going into the
12th. Whoa, okay. Can we pull that up?
So I think we have about 20 minutes roughly. So any questions? Obviously, it could be about the museum, it could be about sport history, it could be about sport issues in general, athletes, teams, whatever it might be. Throw up a hand and we'll come around and stand up and just speak up. Yeah.
What do you think about the Eric Reed situation? How he's been basically ostracized from the sporting contact.
I think the Eric